Qatar helium shock keeps Asia's chip supply under pressure. Months after military strikes disrupted Qatar's Ras Laffan gas and helium complex, the global helium market remains under pressure, forcing semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan and South Korea to depend more heavily on inventories, alternative suppliers, and carefully managed allocations. Qatar's helium facilities normally account for approximately 1/4 to 30% of global supply, depending on the measure used. Iranian strikes on Qatar's Ras Laffan industrial city in March forced Qatar Energy to halt production at one of the world's largest LNG and helium export hubs, removing one of the market's largest concentrated production sources. Qatar Energy later estimated that damage to specific facilities would leave the country's annual helium output about 14% below previous levels, with repairs expected to take 3 to 5 years, while severe restrictions on shipping through the Strait of Hormuz further delayed the movement of remaining exports. The consequences have lasted beyond the initial attack. Industrial gas suppliers have imposed temporary contractual measures and volume allocations. Helium prices have risen sharply, and China added further pressure on July 10th by temporarily banning helium exports. South Korea is particularly exposed, sourcing nearly 65% of its helium imports from Qatar in 2025, while Taiwan also depends heavily on Qatari supply. Helium is essential to semiconductor fabrication, used for wafer cooling, leak detection, and other precision manufacturing processes. Why the shortage has outlasted the initial shock. Liquid helium is difficult and costly to stockpile at fab sites because it must remain near absolute zero and gradually boils off. Manufacturers and distributors therefore maintain inventories, but those buffers are smaller and more technically demanding than conventional commodity stockpiles. Air Liquide has said it holds more than a year's supply stored underground in Germany, though that reserve does not directly resolve tightness in Asian markets. Semiconductor supply chains depend on regular deliveries of high-purity helium. Although larger manufacturers may hold several months of inventory, contract with multiple suppliers, or recover and recycle helium on site. Months after the disruption, the global helium market remains under allocation, and China's July export ban has added a further constraint, just as some of the inventory buffers built up earlier in the year were beginning to run down. Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix have already moved beyond drawing down existing inventory. Both companies finalized new long-term helium supply agreements with U.S. suppliers Linde and Air Products, accepting higher prices in exchange for stable, diversified supply, less dependent on Qatar. That trade, paying more for certainty rather than waiting out the shock, is the same logic showing up across the equipment shortages this desk has covered all year. When a critical input becomes scarce, companies with the leverage to pay a premium secure supply first, and the rest absorb the delay. This adds a new risk category alongside power access. Taiwan and South Korea have spent much of 2026 focused on securing guaranteed electricity for their semiconductor clusters. Taiwan's grid operator has explicitly framed reliable power as core industrial competitiveness, freezing industrial electricity rates while its own reserve margins tighten toward 2028 and 2029. The helium disruption shows that power access, however carefully managed, does not address every input a fab needs to keep running. The disruption has also intensified scrutiny of bromine, another semiconductor input for which South Korean manufacturers depend heavily on Middle Eastern suppliers. Copper markets have tightened for separate reasons, underscoring that semiconductor expansion is exposed to several materials constraints that do not share the same cause. Governments are starting to treat materials as infrastructure. The U.S. government's approach to rare earth and critical mineral supply chains offers one template for how officials are starting to respond. The Commerce Department's CHIPS program has proposed up to $1.6 billion for USA rare earth, including federal funding and a loan tied to a Texas mineral deposit and Oklahoma magnet production, though the underlying mines and processing facilities remain years from commercial output even with funding secured. Companies that treat resource constraints as an early planning input rather than a late-stage surprise have generally fared better through recent disruptions. a lesson the helium shock is reinforcing for an input few site selection teams tracked closely before this year. What this means heading into next week. The helium disruption illustrates a pattern that extends well beyond one gas or one region. Infrastructure lead times are no longer just a function of permitting and grid capacity, but increasingly of materials availability, shaped by geopolitical events thousands of miles from the fab itself. As this desk turns next week to a broader look at industrial expansion and infrastructure lead times, the helium shock is a clear preview of the argument. The constraints slowing down major capital projects are converging across sectors and borders, and companies that track materials risk with the same rigor they apply to power and permitting will be better positioned than those still treating it as a secondary concern. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment+Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.